Good afternoon. I'm Bob Armstrong, Director of the MIT Energy Initiative. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this colloquium featuring Frances Beinecke, a member of the MIT Energy Initiative External Advisory Board. And she's going to talk about 2030 U.S. climate goals, drifting further from the target, how we can get there. Now, before she comes up and tells you all that, so it's a good news story, and to get that started, we provided a rainbow for people to enjoy. That's our good omen here. As she talks about a sort of backdrop for the talk she will give on how do we move the clean energy agenda forward, addressing the needs of climate change, particularly how do we look at the U.S. I think it's interesting to reflect on what a month this has been in terms of major reports or discussions about climate change. Going back to just over 2 weeks ago to the announcement of the Nobel Prizes in economics, featuring actually two former MIT students, Bill Nordhaus and Paul Romer, who looked respectively at issues, but Bill Nordhaus looked at issues of integrated climate assessment and how do you measure or predict the cost of climate change. And in fact, he advocated, one of the early advocates of a price on carbon. And Paul Romer, who looked at role of government in advancing an R&D agenda, in supporting innovation through good IP laws, good protection of technology developments, as ways to reward and help with innovations that deal with big societal issues like climate change. There was also the IPCC special report that came out that highlighted the challenges ahead of us, that maybe things are a little bit more difficult than we thought. And that was echoed today in the National Academy's report that was just released, looking at the need for negative emissions technologies coming down the road. So there's a lot of public awareness and a lot of groups that are highlighting the big challenge in front of us with climate change. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Frances to reflect on her expertise and what she knows about the U.S. and where we're going. It's a real treat to have her here. She was for many years the president of NRDC, and I have to just give you a list of some of the things they do. They of course are focused on curbing global warming, moving America beyond oil, reviving the world's oceans, saving endangered wild places, stemming the tide of toxic chemicals, and advancing clean energy in China and India. And in Frances's spare time, you can tell us what you do after that agenda. She's also plays leadership roles in a number of other environmental groups. She's a graduate of Yale, both master's and undergraduate degrees. And we're really delighted to have her both on our external advisory board, but here to have this conversation. Frances.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Greetings, everybody. Great. So thank you, Bob, very much for that kind introduction. And it is a real pleasure to be here at MIT. I always find coming to MIT incredibly inspiring because the best and the brightest trying to address some of the most serious issues facing all of us. So I appreciate all that you do and all that you will do because we need it. How about nature? Nature rules. How is that rainbow? You know, I thought, well, if your attention drifts, you'd be able to look outside and see this beautiful view, but guess what? They closed the shade. So you're stuck with me, and what I'm looking forward to do is just giving you my assessment based on the other assessments that Bob mentioned that have come out of where we are on climate policy and a climate trajectory here in the United States. But what I really look forward to is talking with Bob at the end of this, and most of all, hearing your questions and your commentary at the end, because this is certainly an issue that we are all in together. It requires full engagement by those who care about the future well-being of people and the planet, and it is an enormously complex issue, a challenging one, and one that will be with us far into the future, long after I am gone. But many of you will still be here, and that's the good news. So it's no surprise, I think, to anyone in this room that the planet is warming, and it's warming extremely rapidly, more rapidly than I think we really understood before. And thanks to the IPCC, we're getting regular information on that. What I think is most significant now is that the human consequences of climate change are being much more understood. And they are really devastating, whether it's from rapid sea level rise to the spread of infectious disease to extreme weather events. A warming planet is going to affect millions, and those who are most affected are going to be the poorest people in the world. And we, as a nation that has made a major contribution to carbon in the atmosphere, have a real responsibility to take leadership and do something about it. Just this month, I mean, you can look at really any month, but just in this month, in the last few weeks, the devastation of Hurricane Michael in Florida, where thousands of people still are without power. We saw that last year with Maria, but now, and that, you know, we for months looked at what the steps that were or were not taken in Puerto Rico, and now we're seeing the same thing in Florida. And this is what we can expect as the planet continues to warm. So we've had Katrina, Sandy, Hugo, Maria, Michael. How many more extreme weather events do we need before we understand the responsibility of taking action? What I want to talk about today is what can we do about it, and are we doing that? For those of us, and I am one of them, who spent decades on the issue of climate change, we fluctuate between really hope and despair. I think that many of you who are working on this probably feel that every day as these reports come out. But today I want to concentrate on the hopeful. I want to leave you hopeful that the actions that you take, that the career paths that you follow can and will make a real difference on whether we as a human species can take responsibility for the implications our actions are having on the well-being of people and the planet. Rather than despair, I want you to be motivated to engage in the climate challenge, to participate in the research and develop the innovative technological and policy solutions that are necessary for our collective future. 4 years ago, I wrote a book called The World We Create, A Message for Hope for a Climate in Peril. And the planet is in much greater peril than when I wrote the book, and it's hard to find the message of hope, but I will try to find that. But what I thought actually, in retrospect, in the title, the most important word was the world we create, because it is about we. This is a responsibility that we all have, and I think for each of us to focus on that is really important. And the we represents multiple actors. It represents we as individuals, it represents elected officials, mayors, governors, federal leaders, heads of corporations. Really, in every walk of life, we have a role and can take responsibility for this. So I'm going to start with what we could call good news, and what that is, from my point of view, is that we understand the science. We know what is causing climate change, we know what the rate is, and we know what we need to do about it. We know it is imperative to keep warming below 2 degrees centigrade and hopefully closer to 1.5 to avoid the worst impacts to people and to our natural systems. We do know that the technological and economic changes across our energy system are necessary for the transformational change in the energy use that is required to avert the worst impacts of climate change. We know we need an all-of-the-above strategy of mitigation through emission reductions, supercharging efficiency mandates, unleashing renewables, and capturing carbon through our natural sinks, our forests and soils, as well as technological removal. We also know that we need a clean energy transformation that is an economic boost. And there has been a lot of work done in that area by the new climate economy reports that have come out, as well as a group that's affiliated with NRDC environmental entrepreneurs that has documented over 3 million jobs created in the clean energy sector in the United States that are functioning now. But knowing what we need to do and acting on that knowledge are entirely different. So just to look at where we are, the bad news is that we are not on track to reach the 1.5-degree aspirational target or even the 2-degree target set in Paris in 2015, as you can see from this slide. We're not on track to reach the individual country targets that were set in Paris, and we knew at the time that those were not adequate. And there was a hope that starting in 2018, countries would come up with even greater ambition. It's not at all clear that in December, when COP meets again, that will indeed be the case. The recent IPCC report that Bob just mentioned, assessing what it would take to achieve the 1.5-degree target, shows that an unprecedented acceleration of actions are necessary between now and 2030. That's 12 years from now. That is very, very soon, because we've already baked in almost 1 degree of change in our natural systems. And the reality is that if we continue on this trajectory, we're going to be at a 3-degree change. The most troubling thing I found in the IPCC report was really the documentation on what the human consequences were between a 1.5-degree change and a 2-degree change. And the differences are significant in sea level rise, in loss of coral reefs, in melting of Arctic sea ice, in extreme weather events, and most consequentially, the difference between how many more millions of people's lives will be disrupted by a warming planet. Taking one example only, at 1.5-degree change, 14% of the world's population will experience the consequences of extreme heat. But that number more than doubles to 37% at 2 degrees. So there is a huge implication of the difference between holding to 1.5 and going to 2. The IPCC report makes clear the urgency of action and the comprehensive transitions in our land use, our energy use, industrial, transportation, and urban systems that are essential to reaching this goal. Make no mistake, we are on a trajectory where the human consequences of a warming planet are devastating. And we do not yet have, certainly, leadership here in the United States or globally required to meet this challenge. There has been leadership. The UN has provided leadership through the IPCC by telling us what is actually happening. The scientific community has provided leadership. Countries are recognizing the threat and acting on it. Cities, states, and corporations, subnational actors have stepped up, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But the role of the United States as a nation with the world's largest economy is far from taking the responsibility that's required. Avoiding the worst impacts of a warming climate cannot be achieved without a doubling down of greater ambition, greater acceleration, and new national policies across the world that will drive this transition forward and align major financial resources with the mitigation and adaptation investments that are essential. So let's focus on where we are in the US. Well, guess what? We're not on track. The good news is that the first commitment that the United States made was to have a 17% reduction in emissions by 2020, and we're actually going to achieve that. The power sector has changed very rapidly, as you're well aware, with the advent of both renewables and natural gas. But we are not nearly on track to reach the 26 to 28% reduction that was the Paris target, or the target that the US set in Paris. And the administration's current strategy is to roll back every element of climate policy that was enacted during the Obama administration. So going back a little bit, during the whole first term of the Obama administration, the environmental community had hoped and pushed and advocated for action on climate. And many of you will remember that in the first term, the priority issue was health, and that really dominated. But in the second term, Obama did take up climate in a very serious way. In June 2013, he made a speech laying out his climate strategy. And I remember it vividly. It was a hot day in June in Georgetown University. And we were all sitting outside, and it was really hot. It was so hot that as he made this speech, the teleprompter broke. Sweat was pouring off of him, off of everyone else. And he was laying out the strategy that the US would follow to meet its climate obligations. And he had to do that using existing authority because many of us had worked on legislation, 2009 and 10, the Waxman-Markey bill, which got through the House, failed in the Senate. And it was clear after that that it was going to be impossible to get legislation. So he and his team designed all the elements of the plan basically using existing authorities and worked diligently, literally until the last day of the administration, to put them in place. But now they're all being undone. The Clean Power Plan, the fuel efficiency standards, clean car standards, methane rules, the commitment to phase out HFCs, a super pollutant, are all being unraveled bit by bit, time by time. They're all of those rollbacks are being challenged in court, but we won't know who's going to win in those legal suits. It's going to take a lot of time to get to the end result. So basically, we're on a pause, if not on a backwards trend on meeting our obligations and reducing our emissions and unleashing the technologies that we need to move forward. Our first strategy, this is the environmental community's first strategy, is defense. That's litigation, holding the line as strongly as possible to keep those rules in place, and most fundamentally, not to allow the basic laws like the Clean Air Act that these are based on to be unraveled. The second is to defend California's ability to be a leader. California has a special waiver under the Clean Air Act, enabling them to set stronger policies in the United States. And in the transportation sector, they've done that with clean car standards and a zero emission vehicle mandate, which the federal government doesn't have. So California, and I'm going to talk about in a minute, is a major leader. Enabling them to lead, not blocking their ability to lead, is really essential. So defending the California waiver is very important, and then building very strong voice for climate action at the legislative level. In the Obama administration, they came out with this report, the Midcentury report, and it basically shows you the building blocks of what needs to happen to bring our emissions down into the safer range. So the priority is to do defense, and then in the early 2000s to move into a proactive strategy to put in place a national policy that will bring emissions down and unleash new technologies. That will include federal commitments on research, on emerging technologies, incentives for corporations, price on carbon, and national policies translated into regulations. Again, to make this happen, we need much broader public support than we have now. And although there is increasingly recognition among the public about the climate peril, that has not yet been translated into political action, to political will that can result in legislative changes. And there still remains tremendous opposition from embedded interests like the coal industry, the oil and gas industry, many conservative donors, and of course the leader of the Republican Party. We know what to do, and for the most part, we know how to do it. A lot is happening at the subnational and corporate level, but make no mistake, goals cannot be achieved without federal action and leadership. National policy is critical, and to get that, we need political will. So where is the US now? Well, the good news is it's happened, I guess, in Paris in 2015. It was not just a conference of parties. There were tens of thousands of people from other sectors. There were mayors, there were heads of corporations, there were governors, from not only from the United States, from all over the world, coming together and making their own climate commitments. And they were very apparent in Paris, but when President Trump announced he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, that group coalesced together in a coalition, the We Are Still In coalition. And just last month in California, Jerry Brown and Mike Bloomberg hosted a conference, the Global Climate Action Summit, where again, all those parties came together and made much more aggressive public commitments about what they would do. to address the climate challenge, to show that in the United States there was still tremendous eagerness and determination to take on this challenge even without the federal government. One of the, I think, key things that they did was they sponsored a study called Fulfilling America's Pledge, where they really did research with the Rocky Mountain Institute and World Resources Institute, identifying what actually the commitments added up to. Because it's easy to make commitments, but you got to know what they result in, and somebody needs to do the accounting to make sure that they're real. So in this slide, they basically show you in the yellow line that the commitments that have been made, if realized, would get us to 20% reduction. That with greater ambition, they could reach the Paris target of a 26% reduction, and with tremendous ambition, they could get even farther than that. And in this slide, they show what the 10 major actions, these are for the subnational actors, are. And none of these are surprising to you. It's doubling down on renewable energy, accelerating coal retirements, encouraging efficiency retrofits, electrifying building use, accelerating EVs, phasing down superpollutants like HFCs, and stopping methane leaks. Also, looking for initiatives to develop regional prices on carbon and developing strategies for natural sinks. So this is a good template. I mean, it really shows you the variety of things that need to happen and shows areas that everybody can engage in. If people have a particular thing they're interested in, want to pursue, this is a great template for how to do that. And of course, the leader of all the subnationals is California. And I think it's important to pause on California for several reasons. One is, California is big. As Jerry Brown likes to remind us at every moment, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. It's very big. When California does something, it has major implications. So they have taken on the climate challenge. Not only Jerry Brown as the governor, but the legislature. They have very diligently adopted policies across every sector. They are experimenting with what works and what doesn't work in carbon, cap and trade, in land use regulations, in credits for sinks, in EV mandates. I mean, they are doing it all. And in doing that, they're basically showing what can be done, what doesn't work, and it's a model not only for other states, but for regions in other countries. I mean, Jerry Brown has lots of conversations with people all over the world. California's role here is as a global model, not just as a model for the US. It's hugely significant, very important, and we're very fortunate that they have taken that leadership on. That not only Jerry Brown, but the legislature and the regulatory structure, the California Air Resources Board, CARB, which is an immensely powerful agency, when they passed one of their first pieces of legislation, AB 32, CARB went out and hired 120 people. Most states can't do that. They just don't have the ability to turn around that quickly. California is big, powerful, and has the resources to experiment with these things, see how they work, get them right, and create models for the rest of us. And the good news is, it's not just California. There are 17 states that have come together in the US Climate Alliance to model, agree on reaching the Paris targets. And here in Massachusetts is part of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that's focused on the power sector. Now those states are in a conversation to do a similar initiative on transportation. And transportation is now the largest source of emissions in the United States. It was power. As I mentioned, the power sector has moved very quickly. So now it's transportation. And transportation is difficult because the emissions continue to rise. They're rising across every sector. And what happens as we design sustainable transportation in autonomous cars, whether we unleash EVs, whether we're able to design sustainable transportation systems to get people out of their cars. This is one of the major challenges, not only facing the United States, but facing society globally, because we have a very aggressive or high level of car use, but that's beginning to happen in other parts of the world as well. So these pieces from the states, increasingly from California, from corporations in At the California Summit, 492 corporations announced they would be committed to reaching the science-based targets for carbon reductions. Cities, which are also incubators of change here, a lot of these policies are translated into action in cities. People, this is where we live, this is where we have our families, this is where we could see climate policies actually enacted, see their results, and be part of the equation. All of those elements are creating something that we're starting to call the new climate federalism. Originally, we thought we're going to have a national policy, it's going to come down and sort of feed across. It's going the other way now. It's happening in cities and states and corporations. That will weave together and hopefully, in the early 2020s, will translate into a national policy based on, it'll be an evidence-based result, based on models that work, where we've seen great success, where we can build on that and sort of learn from doing. So before I finish, I just want to identify 3 areas that I think deserve attention, and I'm sure they're getting attention here, but we're going to need a lot more. So I've talked about a lot that is going on. What I want to focus on briefly is what needs to go on. One is the area of nuclear power. So MIT did the future of nuclear energy in a carbon-constrained world, and I'm sure lots of people here have read that in detail. I've read the executive summary. But I think the thing about nuclear is just always an interesting question, and I've been in a nuclear conversation for, I'd say, well, my whole career, but most recently, over the last 15 years at DOE, and looking at how do we move forward? I mean, we do have a nuclear fleet. It is aging. We're not building new nuclear plants. There's a lot of technological barriers, economic barriers, safety barriers, and barriers in public confidence. And yet, when people look at what do we do in a carbon-constrained world, people invariably say nuclear is part of that solution. But we have not figured out how to overcome that barrier, so that's indeed true. And I also know, an equivalent number of people on both sides of that issue. In Asia, I know China has said, and so has India, that they're going to build nuclear plants. But, I was just reading earlier today, that's not happening in China. They're still building coal plants. They're not moving to nuclear plants. So there's always this kind of nuclear dream out there, but is it real? Will it be realized? Will there be public acceptance? Well, somebody has to work on the technical aspects of that, and that's certainly MIT. And I think that the jury's out. I don't know what will happen on that, but if some of you don't work very hard on trying to get answers to those questions, I'm pretty sure it will not be part of the answer. Secondly, and Bob mentioned this, the issue of negative emissions. The IPCC report was crystal clear that even with all the emission reductions that we can get out of the system, there's too much warming baked in to have that be the only equation. Part of the equation, natural sinks are not enough. And in fact, our forests continue to degrade. We're not doing the restoration work at the level that would be necessary to create those an adequate number of sinks. So the technological answer to how we capture and sequester carbon is a huge body of work that there are new companies getting developed. There's a certain amount of work going on it, but it's not at the level of commercialization, and the price hasn't been brought down, and we don't have a price on carbon that would incentivize it, and all of those things have to happen to make CCS really work. And I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room who know quite a bit more about it than I do, but I just think this is an area that MIT and others in the field of technology really need to focus on, because is it going to be part of the solution? Can we get there? Who knows? I don't know, but hopefully you will know. And the third area that I don't think is quite as technical, but has also been neglected, is the area of industrial emissions. We've focused a lot on power and transportation, but if you add up all the industrial emissions in the US, that's the 9th largest source of emissions in the world. And we're not looking at that. And that's not only an issue of how we reduce our emissions, it's an issue of how do we remain competitive. If other countries are looking at how to make their industrial activities more efficient and cleaner, they are going to outcompete the US in these areas. And I think this is an area of real neglect that, again, here at MIT, you could really focus on to great advantage, and probably already are, as Bob, I'm sure, will tell me as soon as we sit down. Finally, what is the national policy that's going to make a difference here? The best thinking on the issue thinks that it's going to be a price on carbon. So whether that's a carbon tax or a carbon fee, or whether it's a fee and dividend, or the money goes into a clean energy fund, or it's used to take care of the growing federal deficit, who knows? The details of what that design is are yet to be developed. But the good news is there's more and more conversation. I wouldn't say that we're at the point where conversation has become momentum, but it is a conversation. And it's a conversation that actually crosses the partisan aisle, which I think is absolutely essential to getting a result in the future. We do need a price on carbon. Having George Shultz and Jim Baker and others talk about what that could be, I think is just very, very important. There is a House Climate Caucus now with 90 members, 45 Republicans and 45 Democrats, which is a very good sign. There was a proposal in Congress by Representative Curbelo from Florida to put a price on carbon. Of course, it didn't go anywhere, but the fact is that it was proposed by a Republican was, I think, a possible breakthrough moment here that is very, very important. I'll just say, without going into the details, how the price on carbon is designed is going to be really important. Just saying price on carbon, you know, it's got to be at a price where it drives emissions down. A lot of the proposals are to replace, to put the price on and get rid of the regulatory structure. I can just tell you, the environmental community is not going to sit by and let that happen without a lot of detailed analysis and probably a pretty strong fight over that issue. So it's not an easy road ahead. It's a complex road. It's going to take a lot of analytical work to design something that would get broad enough public acceptance. But it is going to be probably the policy design that's essential going forward. So finally, what I want to talk about is how do we actually accomplish this? Well, from someone who's been in the advocacy world for 40 years and looking, or more at this point, looking at what it takes, it's just crystal clear now that we're not going to be able to move forward without political will. And what does it take to get political will? Well, now I think, you know, we're in a very good place where most Americans do support diverse policies to reduce warming. 85% support funding for more research in renewable energy, 77% support regulating carbon as a pollutant, 70% support strict CO2 limits on coal, and 68% support a carbon tax. But supporting and engaging in political action to demand policies and get change is very different. And Tony Lacerowitz at Yale, it's the Yale Communications program, has done a lot of work on where the American public is and what it could take. And I think this slide is very important because it shows that if someone is hopeful and understands that this is a solvable problem, which it is, they're more likely to be engaged than if they understand it's a serious problem and have given up. So I think, and there are plenty of people in that area too. I mean, I cannot tell you, and I'm sure this happens to many of you too, but when I see somebody who I haven't seen for a long time, yeah, what are you doing since you've been at NRDC? And then they go, do you have any hope? And I do, actually. I have hope because I'm here with you. I have hope because we know what the problem is and we know how to solve it. I have hope that young people will demand change because their future is at stake. But the one thing I think that is very critical is people need to engage. The election is going to come up in a few weeks. People need to vote. We have an abysmal voting record in this country. It's so low. Voting matters. You know, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, you know, during the Vietnam War era and a lot of engagement. And, you know, we believed that the federal government had a very big role to play in focusing on issues that were important to human well-being across the country, and we worked to advance change at the government level. I spent most of my career thinking that the federal government was the answer. Now I'm thinking, you know, we need leadership. We need leadership wherever we can get it. But part of leadership is demanding leadership by the people whose job it is to provide it. That only comes if elected officials hear from constituents who care about the issues, whether it's healthcare or climate or a host of other issues. You know, people cannot be passive in today's world. It's just not a time for that, no matter which side of the aisle you're on or what you're thinking about. We all need to be engaged. And I think the hopeful future that we all have is one that envisions people engaged in our democracy, engaged in demanding change, engaged in promoting the solutions to some of the toughest issues that we face. MIT is a place where that can happen. I know all of you are going to go on to very bright careers. You can be involved in this issue, whether it's in your professional capacity or your personal capacity. This is about the human well-being, the well-being of all of us, our children, our grandchildren, of which I have almost five. And you know, I care deeply about their future. And I care deeply about the well-being of the many, many millions of people who are being harmed by the effects of climate change every day, who actually had no contribution to it. So here we are in a society that made a major contribution to this global issue that we face, and we all need to be part of the solution. And I'm hopeful that you all will take that on. Thank you for your attention. And now comes the fun part.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic, Frances. So we're gonna just talk here for a little bit with Q&A, and then open it up to the audience. So if you can be thinking about the questions you have and want to ask. And while you're doing that, though, I'll ask you a couple of questions that are on my mind. And up at the top is where you ended, which is how do we get the country together, focused on these issues? It seems to be a wedge issue, and it seems to me we need to be able to make climate change and its impact on us a nonpartisan issue, not just bipartisan, but nonpartisan, so that we can develop win-win solutions there.
So I agree with that, and you know, I have to say that I think that the environmental community is, and listen, I was part of it for a very long time, still am, probably contributed to that to a degree. When I left NRDC, I thought I'd write a book on all the mistakes we made. We all make mistakes as time goes on, and you look back and think about what they were, and oh my gosh, why did I do that? I listened to a podcast recently by Katharine Hayhoe, who maybe many of you have heard of, who is a professor at Texas A&M, I think, and she addressed this very issue, and it was, you know, we have to start with shared values. Let's not start from what we disagree on. Let's start with what we agree on. And I actually think that these extreme weather events, what happened in North Carolina, what happened in Florida, you know, people are like, wow, what do we do about this? And so I think that we need to look at what are the building blocks. That's why I'm very heartened by this sort of subnational action, because I think if people are engaged in their own communities, in their own cities, on what will make that city more livable and, you know, more economically prosperous because they're developing a strategy that's going to be more efficient, that's a good way to go. I think that, you know, there is an echo chamber out there which is very tough on climate. I mean, you know, going back to when, you know, the first initiative that Bill Clinton and Al Gore put in that was roundly defeated, and that was 1993 or 4 probably, and we've been on that same road ever since. So we've got to try something different and try it with people who are willing to be leaders, who are not of, you know, of the environmental community, but, you know, care about their own home, their own community, and their well-being, and try to build from the bottom up.
Yeah. It seems that for a lot of people, the economy and economic benefit is also at the top of their list. I think back to you had a slide that showed sort of the 10 things we could be focusing on. The top,
yeah.
Top number one was doubling down on renewables. And I think there's an interesting story there that if you look in the U.S. today, there's a lot of solar going in, obviously, in the West, California, a lot going on in states like Massachusetts, which aren't the greatest solar resources in the country. But there's a lot of wind. If you look at wind growth, that's in the middle of the country. You know, so we often associate these as the red states and the blue states. But it looks like everybody's benefiting economically.
Well, actually, it's interesting because one of the things that has endured is the tax credits for wind generation, which were, you know, they're always time limited, so they have to be redone. But the greatest advocates were the Republican governors from those states because they were creating a lot of value in those states. And I think that, you know, that's where the fact that there are over 3 million people in the country who are employed in the clean energy sector, North Carolina was going to get rid of its renewable portfolio standard, and it was the people in the solar industry who prevented the legislature from doing that because there was economic value there. So, you know, I think this whole issue of, you know, regulations or job killing or it's jobs or the environment, I actually think, I mean, there are people who say that, fine. But I think the data shows something entirely different. And going forward, we have to be very data-driven. You know, we have to look at where the solutions actually work economically and promote that as aggressively as possible. So it's not that just the technology, it's where are the economic drivers that are going to be winning, because that is essential to success. If you don't have that, you're not going to get the programs adopted that you really need.
I think it's a great idea, because I mean, I think if we could focus on doing more of things that are moving us in the direction we want to go, as opposed to focusing on differences that we have, the better off we'll be.
We certainly would be.
Yeah. So I'd like to go back to the nuclear discussion you had. So
that's where you know more than me.
I wouldn't say that, but I did read more than the executive summary.
You probably wrote it. Or
no,
somebody here
no,
wrote it. Many people here wrote it, no doubt.
So one of the pieces there that you pointed out, is many people feel like it's going to be important in getting to a zero carbon future. But there's a part of the problem is a public acceptance issue. We also talked about negative emissions. So in this National Academy's report, the number they put out was about, we need to be, by mid-century, doing maybe 10 gigatons a year negative emissions. Well, that means you have to put that CO2 somewhere, and that's surely going to be underground, right?
Yeah.
And we have a public acceptance issue there, I think, and it's different in the U.S. than it is in other parts of the world. So what I wanted to talk to you about was how do you see, how do we move the public to understand the opportunities there and why that's important?
That is a good question that I don't have the answer to. I think with nuclear, it's very difficult. You know, people are kind of dug in and, you know, accidents happen periodically. I mean, just look at Germany. Germany was moving towards a clean energy future, and after Fukushima, they abandoned nuclear, brought back lignite, and a tsunami is very unlikely in Germany. I mean, it's like, how crazy was that? But, so, I mean, there is an embedded view based on different accidents, and changing that, I think, is very difficult. On sequestering carbon, that is actually an issue that I think you could do a lot of kind of research and preparing people for, because it doesn't have that overview that is similar to nuclear. It seems to me it would be entirely different. But getting ahead of it, thinking about how do you, not only what's the technology, but how do you educate and communicate and inform so it doesn't become such a charged issue. I mean, I think if whoever would have the answer to how you can create a dialogue and common understanding about an issue without it getting polarized, that person would deserve tremendous credit, because, I mean, that's just not the situation we're in now. But I also think that carbon capture and storage, I mean, no doubt needed here, but it will be needed much more in China and India, where they don't have this huge natural gas abundance that we have right now, and they're still, very aggressively developing coal, all of Southeast Asia too. So there might be ways to actually get it going without the kind of polarization which is very typical in the US, and prove the case first. I don't know, that's just
so maybe
an
experiments
idea.
in different parts of the world.
I mean, I actually think with carbon capture and storage, it's got to be a global enterprise. I mean, it's hard to see the United States putting in the kind of effort at this juncture that would result in the leadership in that area that is really required. I mean, it seems to me it needs to be a global collaboration.
Yeah. So, I think certainly one place the U.S. could lead there is in technology development, which
right
is
here.
lowering the cost. So a place like this. But I think the public acceptance is going to be a major issue in implementing.
Yeah, but I think understanding that and getting ahead of it, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but that's an interesting dilemma.
I actually think at the federal level in the U.S., one of the really bright spots right now is the R&D funding level in energy. It's at an all-time high, and that's cutting across basically the entire energy space at DOE, including some very basic research that I think will prepare us for the future. And I think if we can figure out how to leverage that and move it into markets would be very helpful. I wanted to also go back to sectoral opportunities. You talked a little bit about the progress we've made in the power sector. That's certainly been a bright spot. And now in the transportation sector, industry's coming. But what do you see as big challenges yet to attack
I think
in power and transportation?
Well, I think the transportation sector is a very big challenge because the technology is changing very rapidly. We sort of don't know what the future of transportation is. There's EVs, which, I mean, the technology is there. There's no technology barrier to EVs, but you need to incentivize them to unleash. That's why I said California is so important to do that. You need to build the infrastructure to make sure that they could get adopted. I mean, there's a whole, this is where I think the government role, whether it's state or federal, to kind of incentivize that transition, as the renewable portfolio standards did on renewables, is really key. And you were just talking about the new Center of Computing and or school, what is it called? College. AI, artificial intelligence. How is that going to be used to actually facilitate some of this change? I don't have any idea, but I was talking to somebody recently who said, well, that's going to be a major area of interest, how that's used to address some of these serious issues, and the transformation, the transition is going to be very important. And those are issues that need to be worked on and figured out going forward. I mean, I think, we're in a learning moment. We know that we need to drive emissions down, create a clean energy future. We probably know pretty much what's going to happen between now and 2025, maybe 2030. That's not so far from now, but do we have any idea what's going to happen between 2030 and 2050? I mean, things are happening very rapidly, and trying to keep up with those changes and identify where the opportunities and then invest in them so the transitions really are successful, I think is one of the challenges going forward. I mean, the world is speed it up, speed it up, speed it up. So, staying ahead of it and then looking at both what's going to be an aid to the transformation, and then also what could be a block, what could create a barrier that if we could identify it early, we wouldn't have to overcome it later. And, I think those are going to be some of the challenges ahead.
So before we go to the audience, one last question about us as a university here at MIT. So MIT has a plan for climate action that was launched in 2015. There's enormous interest across the campus, from students to faculty and staff, in what we can do to help move the world to a better place, particularly dealing with climate change. What do you think are special roles that a university can play, since we have this nice broad swath of ages and specializations, skill sets. It's a great opportunity. I'm just interested in where you see us playing a special role.
Well, I'll just say that I worked on sustainability at Yale probably 15 years ago, you know, and had sort of wrestled with this question, like, what's the university's responsibility? And first of all, there's responsibility in its own footprint, its own actions, and MIT is certainly, you know, a leader in that moving forward, I think. But I think the university has a real opportunity, all universities really, to create a certain amount of environmental literacy, climate literacy, that people are going to go out, they're going to have a whole range of careers, lots of different things. But you know, a university can equip people with a basic understanding. And, you know, one of the things that has given me hope recently is the fact that these corporate CEOs are now not only creating science-based targets for what their companies are doing, but speaking out on the moral responsibility to take steps on carbon, that they are kind of filling in a vacuum that isn't being fulfilled by others. And I think, so, you know, an MIT graduate, no matter what they go into, they're probably going to face up to major societal issues, and climate is certainly one of them. And being equipped to figure out what's the responsibility to deal with that? How do we deal with that? That's not a compartmentalized issue that's somebody else's responsibility. It's a shared responsibility that they take forth. And I think that's just one of the great strengths that a university has, is to equip people who are going out to operate on a broader level than their own specific expertise, because that's what they're being exposed to here.
Yeah. Thank you. So let's open it up to questions. I think we have some handheld mics that'll rotate around the room here in the aisles. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get one of the microphones to you. Here we are in the front here.
Are you ready?
I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I told you I would heckle you a little bit. Francis, so I struggle when I'm at events, charity events, business events, conferences, and I'm meeting a group of people at dinner or the happy hour that they're influential business leaders, they're government leaders, they're wealthy foundation leaders. And I would tell you that probably 20% of the people I talk to don't really believe climate's that big a deal, honestly. If I went to a university down the street, I would tell you 20% of the trustees there think it's an issue, but it's not really, it's.
I hope that's not true of the MIT trustees.
No, not MIT, but it's just, it scares me when I talk to people. And you know, you get, you know, after a little bit of time at a happy hour, they really say what they think. What are the one or two examples that you could, you know, give us that really resonate with people that are sort of non-believers in climate change issues? That, because when you tell people about the hurricanes, they go basically, well, we've had bad weather before, and they you know, confuse weather and climate. What can I use as a, they can't debate?
Well, so that's a tough issue, and I think because climate's such a polarized issue, it makes it even tougher. It's hard to have the answer to that. One thing I think that climate is not a belief system. It's not do you believe in it or not, it's the science shows us, and particularly coming from MIT, like, to me, the IPCC reports, which are a huge proportion of the world's scientists working on these issues. I mean, the science is in. And, you know, I mean, people can dispute that, but basically, I hope that most leaders in society in our country have some understanding of the importance of science. So I think the science is number one. I actually think extreme weather events have had probably a bigger impact on the way people think of these issues than other things, because they're very personal. Whether you're in Marin County, California, breathing in the wildfires all summer when you've lived there your whole life and that has never happened, it's like, where did all these fires come from, or, you know, it's very interesting reading or, you know, watching the news media and the people in North Carolina after the hurricane went through, where it was like, we have never seen this much water sitting here for this long. Or, you know, Hurricane Sandy, a 14-foot surge in New York City. I mean, I've lived in New York City for, you know, the last 35 years. Nobody nobody around has ever seen that level. And, you know, so I think you have to, and this is, you know, you have to look at or talk to, I don't think there's one answer for the people you're talking to. I think it's identifying what is that individual, where are they coming from, what are they interested in, and what will connect them on why this issue is significant. You know, people who work, I mean, you know, there's so many security concerns around climate, on water scarcity, food scarcity, changing agricultural patterns. I mean, okay, maybe these are specialty issues for people who work on them, but I think increasingly there's just going to be enough changes that are in evidence. I think what's more challenging for Bill is, what can I do about it? You're talking about global trends. You know, what do I as a person do about global trends? And that's why I'm saying getting engaged locally makes a real difference. There were some moms in Cambridge who wanted to do something about climate, and they started this group, Mothers Out Front, and they went to the Cambridge City Council and said, buy renewable energy, and then Cambridge started buying renewable energy, and then they went to Boston, and now they're, you know, in 5 states. So I think you have to personalize it. I don't think, you know, I mean, we've been at the kind of global level for a long time, and I think that just loses people. It just does. You have to, it has to be immediate and personal, and unfortunately for all of us, that reality is a lot more real than it used to be.
It's a great question. Back here.
So you talked about how you can't just have a carbon price, it has to be the right carbon price, and that if you do it wrong, that, for example, environmental groups are going to fight it. So I'm curious as to what you meant by that, and also, given that there's not much time, should we maybe just settle for a carbon price that's there, but maybe not perfect?
Yes, so there's sort of a quid pro quo of the carbon pricing initiatives, and, you know, we need a price on carbon, because that's this, you know, did I say this, that I had this conversation with Janet Yellen in 2000 at Yale, and she said, oh, the best way to solve this is a carbon tax. And I was like, well, I get that from an economic standpoint of view, but what's the political strategy to get there? And now it's 2018, and we haven't quite figured that out. So yes, we need a price on carbon, and there is a lot of support for that in theory, but that hasn't been translated into legislative action, particularly from major corporations like Exxon that loves to tell you how much they support that, but who's seen them lobbying for that? Nobody that I've seen. Part of it is, part of the proposal is we need a price on carbon, and once we get that, we'll do away with all the regulations. Well, you know, regulations are there, like Clean Air Act regulations, a lot of them are there for public health benefits. And a price on carbon doesn't necessarily translate into public health benefits. So I think you have to be, my only point was, you have to be concerned about the design. You need a price level that's high enough to drive down emissions. You need to evaluate, one of the proposals is, you know, if you put a price on carbon and let the oil and gas companies off of tort liability, that, you know, protect them from liability, and therefore they'll support it. Well, you know, you have to evaluate the pluses and minuses of all of that. And so I don't know what the perfect design of a carbon price would be. I would just say it's a bit of a minefield out there, and there's no simple answer, and you have to factor in what's the design that's going to get the broadest support to create political will to get this done. And that should be both to get it done and to achieve the goal, which is to drive emissions down and have a clean energy transformation. So, you know, there are lots of ways that it could be done badly. What you want to do is design it in a way that it achieves the goal.
I think one of the big issues with these taxes is what do you do with the money? And it becomes a literal food fight at that point. One of the plans that I like a lot is the George Shultz. You mentioned the Schultz, Baker, Paulson et al.
And
plan.
actually, Justin Trudeau in Canada today proposed that in January, Canada would adopt, I think, a tax and dividend program for the provinces that hadn't put one in place already, which was, that's our very close neighbor to the north if we're still friends.
Yeah. But that was interesting because it had these 4 points to it. You touched on many of those. One was put a tax in place and ratchet it till you get to a level where you have desired impact. Second was to make it revenue neutral, so you return the money, and the proposal they made was a progressive return of money. So every person with a Social Security number or every household, some way to distribute equally, which would then help people who are hit the hardest by the tax. The third part,
and I think that isn't true of British Columbia. They have that now. They are returning that.
Part that British Columbia can't do, and that the states in the U.S. can't do, was part 3 was to put a border adjustment clause in place, right? So only the federal government can do that for the U.S., and that's how you deal with leakage, right? So that if you have a price on carbon, you worry about importing goods from cheaper countries because they don't have a carbon price, and that deals with that. And then you mentioned concern about the fourth point, which of their plan, which is you eliminate the regulatory authority once the other 3 parts are up and working.
So here's an interesting thing. On the ballot in November, Washington State has a carbon price on the ballot. And, you know, it's going to be interesting to see whether it wins or not. It has very strong opposition to it, as well as a less well-financed but strong group supporting it. And I think that'll be an indicator about whether there is an appetite to go down that road. We'll see.
Yeah, good. Maybe one more question here? And then, okay. Maybe there were other people here first, and maybe 2 questions, and we'll do one.
So I'm Bert Jaffe. You mentioned forest fires with destruction, loss of lives. You mentioned flooding with economic damages. And there's a beginning of a movement asking for climate reparations. And since we know the fossil fuel companies are the ones primarily responsible, there's an attempt by California, Baltimore, other cities and states to sue these fossil fuel companies for reparations. Do you think they have a leg to stand on, and might it be successful?
So there is a lot of work being done on attribution, where apparently you can do the analytics now to show what companies' contribution has been. And there have been a number of cities in California that have brought these suits. I believe that some of the early ones have been dismissed already, but part of, I think, the strategy behind them is to put the companies on notice that there is a responsibility here, and the attempt to hold them accountable is not going to go away. And to drive them toward, this is sort of how you evaluate climate risk, to drive them towards being stronger proponents of a carbon price and putting policies in place. There's sort of a comprehensive strategy. So, I mean, apparently you can identify the contributions of the major source companies, and I think there will be tremendous efforts to hold them accountable for those contributions. But let's just say we have a shared responsibility here, because guess what? We all use the energy. And I think, you know, that's where, I mean, you can, you know, make the fossil fuel companies the villain. And, you know, I'm sure I've done plenty of that in my day, but guess what? You know, I want my lights to go on. I want my house to be warm. I want to drive my car, as does everybody here. And, you know, I always think about New York after Hurricane Sandy, when a huge part of the city was without power for several days. Our home was out without power for 5 days, and guess what? It's not great to live without power. And, you know, we need to find a common solution here that we're all part of. And hopefully at some point we'll get the fossil fuel industry to take some leadership. I think that's beginning to happen in Europe, much more than in the US, but maybe Europe will show the way here. I mean, this is a global problem that we're all implicated in. And, you know, I think the good news is there are a lot of solutions out there. There's a very bright future that has much more efficient, much more cleaner sources of energy. If we had the will, you know, to get there, we could get there, and we should get there. I mean, I'm optimistic that we can get there. The thing that is discouraging to me is how embedded this increasingly small but very mighty group, not mighty like you guys, but
that
mighty
would be
group
us.
of
Yeah.
opposition is. I mean, it's just unfathomable to me when you read the IPCC report and see what is happening around the world. And one of the issues that you didn't mention, but is just very pointed to me, are all these, you know, hundreds of thousands of people who are trying to migrate from one place to another. And if you look at why they're leaving the places, there are different reasons, but a lot of it is scarcity, water scarcity, food scarcity, desertification, and other things. And, you know, we got to take responsibility here and act and not let a few embedded interests hold us back from doing that.
So I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. Because I like this theme of working together. And I'd like to point out one of the themes in the Climate Action Plan at MIT was working together with industry. And we've had some nice examples with oil and gas companies in Europe originally, with Shell, Total, BP,
Yeah,
and
they've
others.
been
With
leaders
the
on
Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, ExxonMobil and Chevron have just joined that this year. ExxonMobil just announced support of the Schultz-Baker
I
et
saw
al.
that, yeah. I want to see
plan.
them
So-
in Congress pushing for
Okay, that's where.
price on carbon.
Okay.
Tell me when it happens.
We're moving there, though, right? So anyway, so let's all thank Frances for a really interesting conversation.
Thank you all. Great to be here.